Thanks for joining us for another episode of Emerging Environments. In this episode of the podcast, we sit down with Ian Mauro, an environmental scientist, filmmaker, associate professor of geography at the University of Winnipeg, and the executive director of the Prairie Climate Centre. Ian wears many hats and is involved in a variety of Canadian climate change science and advocacy initiatives.
In our conversation with Ian, we spoke about his connection to the North and how he got into filmmaking. Ian specializes in community-based research and climate change communication and uses film to tell stories about the impacts of climate change, particularly health impacts in northern Indigenous communities.
We also spoke with Ian about the work of the Prairie Climate Centre, including their flagship project, the Climate Atlas of Canada, and the ongoing evolution of climate services in the prairies. It was a fantastic conversation, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did.
Okay. Hi, Ian. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us today.
Of course, great to be here.
So before we get into the Prairie Climate Centre and a lot of the work that you've been doing recently, we'd love to know a bit more about you. So, if you can tell us where you're from and how did you become interested in environmental science, way back when?
Well, it's great to be able to share these stories. So I was born in Thompson, Manitoba in the north, and my parents moved around and we left the north when I was still quite young. And I think I had always been looking northward ever since, how identity and place are so interconnected. And I was always curious about what's happening up there. And I had the opportunity as a young person to spend a lot of time with my grandparents on their farm. And I was out there learning from my grandfather in particular how to weld, how to hunt, how to trap. And the farm was on the border of a reserve in Alberta, the Paul Band Reserve. And my grandparents took me to powwows and they took me to these cultural events. And I started to kind of realize that the world was so much bigger than I understood as a young person. And as I started to kind of move forward in my journey, I became very interested in studying the environment. I ended up riding my bike to California after high school graduation.
Oh, wow.
And so I pedaled my way down there, and the pace of a bicycle in nature is amazing in that you really slow down and you get to look around and you get to contemplate and think. And that journey was a journey of self-discovery in a sense. And I realized, I want to commit myself to studying the environment. This is really important to me. I was hearing about all the things on the news. That was 97, and that was a El Nino year where the actual ocean currents had started to change directions. The temperatures were changing. Jellyfish were coming up into the coasts of Oregon and Washington State. And people were saying, the environment's going haywire. And I'm this kind of young person just graduating from high school. People are talking about climate change. There's these new species kind of drifting up into the ocean where they hadn't gone before. And I really did start to realize, there's a calling here and there's an importance to kind of commit to studying this stuff, but trying to obviously contribute to the solutions that solve, the environmental crises writ large. And as that kind of journey continued, I got into university, I got into environmental science. And I think the real kind of shift into climate change in particular happened when I took a travel study course to the Arctic. And so I actually got to go to a place called Pangnirtung on Baffin Island. And I traveled up there for a summer to end my environmental science degree. And that just completely blew my mind in that we were interacting with elders who were talking about their intergenerational knowledge of the changes that they were seeing to the Arctic. And that for me was really, really transformational. And I ended up becoming instructor on that program and spent the first decade of the 2000s living in Pang almost every summer. And teaching up there. And I got to see the Arctic melting with my own eyes and watching the multi-year ice not come back as much or in smaller kind of formations, and hearing, the elders talk about that over the course of their intergenerational knowledge, and realizing there is a real important story here. And there's a role for scientists to be working with community to better understand the change and figure out how to recalibrate to it. And so that whole journey kind of changed my life and really led me to the academic work that I'm now involved in.
Amazing story. Yeah, there's definitely something to be said for going on those long adventures and going to those places and seeing things in real time. That's amazing. And so now you're the executive director of the Prairie Climate Centre. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the center and I guess your current role there and what that consists of.
Yeah, I came to the University of Winnipeg. I finished my postdoc and just kind of finishing that story of being in the Arctic. I ended up making a film about Inuit knowledge and climate change. And we'll probably talk about some of these things as we go in the conversation. But I ended up landing a Canada Research Chair at Mount Allison University and continued my climate change work out there. But I'm from Manitoba and I'm from Winnipeg. And I really did want to kind of come back home and be near family, and ended up landing a position here at the University of Winnipeg. And when I got to the University of Winnipeg, it became very clear that there was an opportunity for transdisciplinary research to occur with the pre-existing folks that were doing climatology here at the university and my kind of social science, environmental science work. And so in particular, there's a faculty member here in the Department of Geography, Danny Blair. And Danny is one of the longtime climatologists on the Canadian prairies. He had some research assistants, and they had been developing climate maps for the Canadian prairies. And I have this media background, digital mapping and other things. And when we came together and we said, like, can we bring these research programs together? Can we bring that kind of human environmental science work and the climatology together? And we essentially decided that this was important and really useful. And we started to think about how we could build the first climate atlas. And the Climate Atlas of Canada is something that is our flagship project at the Prairie Climate Centre. And in some ways, the Prairie Climate Centre grew around that project, and the project grew around the center. And this idea that, climate data, for the most part, had been under kind of lock and key. Either you had to have a PhD in climatology or a PhD in downloading climate data. Because it was so complicated to even get access to this stuff, let alone understand it. And one of my kind of things that I really hold core to the kind of work is the kind of democratization of data, the democratization of being able to understand the change, but also have agency in being able to respond to it. And so I think those things underlie the Prairie Climate Centre. We're really interested in engaging communities in conversations around data. And so all of these things kind of came together. We started the Prairie Climate Centre, and it's just kind of grown from there. And, we have Prairie in our name because we're located here, but we really are operating across the country. And it's been very humbling because the Climate Atlas is now, I would say, one of the core kind of digital infrastructures of the country for sharing climate data and for mobilizing climate information. And it's been a great experience kind of developing the tool and doing it in a collaborative way with communities and other researchers. And I think it speaks to the power of universities, the power of institutions like ours to create, data and tools in the public good. And to create opportunities for communities to be part of these conversations that otherwise have been, very much located in the kind of ivory tower and in policy circles and in, conversations where experts dominate the discourse. And we really do want to kind of create an opportunity for all Canadians to be part of this. And I think that's just tremendously important if we are going to get the traction that we need to meet things like our Paris Accord targets and to really create the kind of future that we need for our kids to have a livable planet.
So with the core of the center being located on the prairies, are there particular climate change impacts that you focus on sort of in that prairie context, maybe more so than other contexts?
Yeah, well, we work in a variety of partnerships. That is core to, the ethos of the center is that, we're interested in participatory methods when we're, say, making films, even when we're doing kind of adaptation planning and data development. And so in that regard, there are kind of core projects and core ideas and focus areas. One of the kind of major partners that we've helped kind of create is a new organization called Climate West. And so Climate West is the kind of regional climate services organization that is in part funded by Environment Canada and the 3 Canadian Prairie provinces. And so that's a partnership with the University of Regina and the International Institute for Sustainable Development and all those kind of funding agencies. And we are trying to figure out with the governments federally and provincially, what are those priorities for the prairies? What are the things that we need to be looking at? And the prairies is such a massive geography, and what happens in the north versus the south, the idea that the prairie is this kind of ecosystem, but we have boreal and we have subarctic and taiga and tundra. And so we have to kind of think about all the layers of this area and all the diverse considerations. And so for sure, the inclusion and deep respect for Indigenous communities and what's happening in Indigenous territories throughout this area. Drought is a huge issue. We're looking at a pretty dry year right now and the implications for farmers. And so we're very much interested in working with the farm community to think through these issues. And then if you look at the polling data, the prairies has some of the highest, shall we say, concern over the validity of climate science. And we have denial in this part of the world. And, pre-pandemic, one of the biggest issues facing the country and for a long time now has been Western alienation and the issues of, the energy sector in Alberta and, to some extent, or to a large extent, Saskatchewan and maybe less so in Manitoba, where we have a lot of hydropower. But the decarbonization of this area is very polarizing. And so, all these layers together, in my kind of humble opinion, I think the prairies is some ways the kind of key that unlocks the country to bold climate action. Because if we can kind of solve these issues, if we can get through to these different constituencies, if we can create a social mandate for climate action on the prairies, that in some ways kind of allows the whole country to move forward. And so we're active in a number of areas, scientifically, ecologically, sociopolitically, sociologically, to kind of look at all these layers. And we're quite interested in all of that. And I think one of the key things that the Prairie Climate Centre is also interested in is climate communications. And so the idea that, all of this evidence has been around for decades, but what makes it tractionable is really a communication question in a very real way. How we turn that evidence and knowledge into action? And for me, communications is a core feature of getting through to people and building that consensus that climate action is important and something that we can all get behind. And so that's what leads us to kind of do the work that we do in that space.
Yeah. You just work at a few things, right? Just a couple things. That's a huge scope of work.
Well, and it's not just me. There's a team here, right? We have an incredible team of people, and there's other co-directors. Nora Casson is a Canada Research Chair in the environmental influences of water quality. Danny, the climatologist, with tremendous experience, and then we've got a research team of research associates and students, and so there's a crew of us here that make this all possible.
Are there particular members of the organization or the center that work on communications? Are the communication specialists, or is it something that everybody works on together?
Well, we talk about transdisciplinarity all the time. I'm proud to say that I think we are truly a transdisciplinary organization where we have, people with computer science backgrounds linking to climate science backgrounds, linking to, ecosystem science, linking to, social science, health science, and all of that is in conjunction with these communication specialists that we do have on staff. And so we have folks that specialize in social media, but perhaps more specifically, we have 2 full-time filmmakers. And I consider myself a filmmaker. I've made a number of feature films about climate change. And so with all of that together, we are, linking climatologists with filmmakers to make films. We are linking other staff doing other projects with filmmakers to make these films. And so it's been a kind of core a part of the work, and in some ways the thing that we might be the most well known for, right? Because we are pushing the envelope around, getting the information out in different kinds of ways and to different kinds of audiences. And so when you think about, the power of storytelling, and for me, that really is my focus, is how do we tell good climate change stories, and not good necessarily technically, but also in a way that inspires people to understand the dire situation that we are truly in, but the fact that it's not hopeless, and the fact that there is agency across the landscape, and the idea that it's an inclusive story that speaks to the hearts and minds of all kinds of people. And so, when we're working with farmers, for example, there are so many inspiring people on the land, figuring out how to sequester carbon in the shelter belts that they have on the land, or the soil that they manage through the rotational grazing with the cattle that they raise. And these opportunities for people to understand that the farmers on the landscape are not villains in the climate story. They're actually key constituents that can help us to kind of get through this, and kind of building those bridges and building the dialogue and creating a story where we can leverage all of our collective skills and our collective interests to solve this issue. And so I think that climate story has been one that's been science dominated for the most part. And I think that's lost a lot of people. Mm-hmm. That story is only available to certain people who have that lexicon and that understanding of the science. And so we're interested in creating a diversity of stories that include science, but also include the knowledge of Indigenous communities and what their realities are and how they tell that story and what it means to them. And that, to me, is what is going to ideally get us to the next level of kind of a holistic and meaningful ability to respond to the changes we're seeing.
I think in a way you've partly answered Karen's next question, but
well, I wanted to get into a little bit more about the filmmaking side of your work, and maybe starting with the Climate Atlas, and that's kind of where I got to know a little bit about what you do. And so the Climate Atlas, as you mentioned, it was the key project of the Prairie Climate Centre, and so it allows users to kind of map climate changes in temperature, etc. But there's also like this storytelling aspect to the Climate Atlas. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that works and how users kind of engage with that and what the response to that has been like.
Sure. Well, like anybody being interviewed, I'll tell you the answer that I want to tell you, and then we'll get to your specific question. The filmmaking started, again, back in the Arctic in a very real way. And so I was seeing the changes up there. And I mentioned I finished my doctorate, and I actually had been asked by an elder named Joannesy Karpik, who's still alive today in Pangnirtung. And he's one of the most respected elders on Baffin Island, talking about climate change still to this day. And he suggested that it would be important for me to use my experience in the North to help the South understand what was going on because of this huge geographic disconnect, right? How do you get the message out? And, people like Shilawat Kluche had been very effective for many, many decades. But there was just a need for people to kind of ring the alarm bell yet again. And I had the great privilege of meeting Zacharias Kunuk. And Zach Kunuk made the film Atanadjoat the Fast Runner, which is considered the most important Canadian film ever made by many people. And I just happened to meet Zach. I'm this Kadunak or Southerner that speaks enough Inuktitut to get myself into trouble, as I often say. And him and I started kind of talking about the importance of making a film on Inuit knowledge and climate change. And he said, yes, I want to do that too. And next thing I knew, I was in a project with Zach Kunuk making this film. And we shot the film between 2008 and 2010. We released it in 2010, and that was the world's first Inuktitut language film on climate change. And it challenged scientific orthodoxy. It brought Indigenous knowledge to the forefront of the debate at the time. It was in some ways very challenging for people like polar bear biologists, who the Inuit were very critical of around collaring polar bears and these kinds of issues. But the Inuit had started to see some significant changes that were not even well understood by the scientific community. And that film, for me, unlocked the potential of cinema to really engage people in a larger conversation, not just through interviewing people. So we're doing an interview right now, we're having an engagement, but as the podcast goes out, as a film goes out, it causes this ripple of engagement. And so that film went all over the world. We ended up making another film, Climate Change in Atlantic Canada, And then I ended up coming to U of W after that. And we thought to make the Climate Atlas. And in part because these large feature films are massive kind of undertakings, we wanted to make something that had these kind of vignettes and that were a little bit easier to kind of digest and deal with. But also that idea of, I accidentally literally started making these climate change films around the country. And I did not plan to do that. It just, opportunity led to opportunity, led to this idea, oh my goodness, we're working nationally. And I ended up, through that journey, I got to know David Suzuki quite well. Him and I made a third feature film, Beyond Climate, about climate change in British Columbia. These are all available on the internet. And as we were kind of developing those larger films, the Climate Atlas was kind of coming in. And one of the most beautiful things about film is that you get to tell these powerful stories. But one of the saddest parts is that there's this cutting room floor. There's all this material. There's all these interviews that never get dealt with, and all these pieces that don't necessarily fit a big film. And so we started realizing there's all these different narratives that we can kind of grab and get inside a tool if we had a map, if we had an atlas. And so the atlas itself integrates that storytelling with the data, as you mentioned, and it does create, again, these multiple opportunities for engagement. And, you know, as educators, we're, you know, university professors, you know that there's different kind of learners, right? There's people that gravitate to text, there's people that gravitate to kind of oral material. And so those different ways to engage people became a really kind of core way in which we built the architecture of the Atlas. And, you know, we're getting hundreds of thousands of hits, you know, on this thing annually. We're getting tens of thousands of people watching all of the videos, and some serious like traction when you look at the statistics of how people are engaging with this stuff. They're watching this stuff through lots of educators. So we know that the Atlas kind of ramps up in the school year and then kind of declines a little bit over the summer, and we can actually see the educational profile of people and students. We've looked at the stats, you know, where at certain points there's like 50 people online in a community at one time, and you can tell there's like a workshop happening or there's a school using it, and it's just very gratifying to see that strategy playing out and working, and really bringing people into that conversation. And so it's become quite a beautiful opportunity, and a slightly unwieldy one too, right? Because it's a national tool. There's lots to consider. Governance, you know, how do we start to think about, you know, managing this thing over time? One of the exciting things that we're working on right now is data for First Nation and Inuit communities, and as well as Métis projects that will fit in and can be visualized in the map itself. And so we're moving towards, with the guidance of elders and other knowledge keepers that have been helping us with this process, to release a whole new set of Indigenous data for the country and associated tools and films. And so, as they say in the literature, it's a living atlas. This thing is alive in a very real way, and it's something that will continue to evolve and respond to the needs of society, I would say.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing. I love exploring it, and I share it with everybody I meet. It's like, oh, have you seen the Climate Atlas? It's a really amazing communication tool. And so I guess I had a kind of a follow-up question about some of what you started to mention about Climate West and sort of these growing partnerships, and sort of kind of looking back on the foundation of the Prairie Climate Centre. It seems to me that in a way, this center filled a bit of a gap that we had in Canada in terms of like climate services. But now we have, you know, the Canadian Centre for Climate Services and these regional hubs like Climate West. And maybe you could speak a little bit about how these different things now kind of work together, because they all sort of grew independently. Like I'm thinking of Uranos and the Pacific Climate Impacts Group. And so maybe you can speak a little bit about that and how kind of we go forward in terms of climate services.
I think that's a great question. And, you know, we've been fairly involved in that whole kind of evolution of how these different things stitch together. It was great that the federal government put some long-term money on the line to implement the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, which is kind of a coordinating body for these activities nationally. And before that, we didn't really have a group that was helping to kind of organize them. They were kind of piecemeal, and, you know, PKIC out in Victoria services BC because they got the carbon tax, and it really helped establish that group. Quebec is obviously very active with respect to their environmental values and investing in solutions. And Uranos got started, 20 plus years ago. In the Prairies Park at the University of Regina, Dave Sachin's group was has been around actually the longest climate services organization in the country. And, again, all these just little bits, and the Canadian Centre for Climate Services came in, got funded to kind of try and build that strategy out. And so we were able to build Climate West, which is that regional service provider. We work very closely with our counterparts in PKIC and Uranos. There's an Atlantic hub that's likely to come online. They're talking about a northern one. Ontario is trying to get organized. And this idea that we would have climate service organizations that are working together in a federated sense, but really understand the unique needs of the regions climatologically, politically and sociologically, as we mentioned, how to deliver and communicate. French Canada is very different than English Canada. There's so many considerations, but that common strategy is starting to emerge, I would say. And the integration, we're on meetings with all of those partners, weekly and monthly, and we are in conversation about how we move together, as a super organism to support the country. And so I'm quite excited. I think that we're finally at a stage where that kind of traction and structure and understanding of the unique needs of different regions is being honored and being supported. But we're a long ways away from truly getting into, the delivery of services that truly transform the country in the ways that are required. We're in an early stage. Climate services is a weird kind of term too. People don't understand it. So there's language barriers, and what does it mean? And as we get to have more examples where, data and projects with communities lead to like high resolution adaptation that lead to measurable impacts that we can track over time, that you can show to another community to say, hey, this is what this looks like, and this is why this is important, and this why this just saved you $1 million, plus dollars because, and as we start to get that narrative going and that understanding in society, I think we will have that kind of flip, and you'll see that it becomes the normal. And, things like asset management, for example, in municipalities where they're thinking long-term about bridges and roads and infrastructure, and they've got 30-year plans. Well, 30-year plans fit climate change perfectly, right? If we can think in those long-term kinds of ways, and we can plan climate resilience into infrastructure and other activities, you can see how this will create a groundswell of actual change that gets us where we need to be. And so I think I'm very excited by that. But the trick, of course, is the speed at which climate change is coming at us, and whether or not we can respond fast enough to get ahead of that curve. And we're at the time, though, where I think it's very interesting. The pandemic teaches us a lot, and we actually have been doing a lot of research on the linkages between the COVID and climate communications. And, in such a short period of time, we now have grandmothers in their living rooms talking about bending down the curve. And looking at COVID data every day, like, is it safe to be engaging with society? Do I need to stay in? What is the public health measures? What are the scientists saying? We've gotten to a place in society where science has taken a new, role in guiding policy. And we're also in a phase where disruption is real. People are now understanding that we cannot continue in the way that we've been going. And this idea literally of bending down the curve, if we can port that language from the pandemic into a discourse about carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and people realize, we got to work hard at that today because we got to get to a different place, and there's a goal and there's an outcome, and we'll be healthier on the other side. I think we're in a moment that we don't even understand. I think we're in a moment where we could transition all of this and come out the other side much cleaner and healthier. And I think that's what people now understand as being important. Our priorities have changed because of the pandemic, and I think I'm quite hopeful because of that.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, it does kind of feel like that, and I agree. I hope that we can kind of channel some of what we've been going through into, building back better, as people are saying, right? So you mentioned, like, we're kind of in the infancy in a way of climate services and various things. Do you see a time where, we may see kind of policies around adaptation, like we're kind of, seeing in terms of mitigation, okay, we want, these big national, pan-Canadian framework on emission. Like, do you see something similar happening for adaptation, or do you think that it is very regional, very specific, like case by case kind of thing?
Well, I think it's both, and certainly, like, the federal government has now mandated that there be a national adaptation strategy, and so this is happening. And I think we've gotten to the point where there's an understanding that mitigation is one part of the puzzle, and it was the only part of the puzzle, and people were fixated on it, and the amount of investment in trying to kind of rein in our greenhouse gas emissions was paramount and still remains paramount. But I think people have started to realize that in the absence of that action happening, 30 years ago, and really driving down, the emissions and the associated impacts, we do now have to start adapting. And adaptation there's a real monetary case for how it's going to save not only money, but lives. And so people are starting to realize that this needs to be much more better coordinated. And so there is a call for this national adaptation strategy. I know a lot of the federal ministers are working together to kind of figure out what that means. The linkages with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services and these regional partners now, that stuff all clicks together ultimately into, I think, a real palpable opportunity to get adaptation at the level that mitigation is currently at, and to ensure that we are moving forward with a multifold strategy that ensures that our communities are safe and ensures that regardless of what happens, we are increasingly preparing ourselves. And so, we're early in the journey, but the thing is that I think the realization of the importance of getting this in place fairly rapidly is upon us. And so I think we're going to springboard adaptation to a new level in the coming decades, and sooner than later, like in the coming years. And so it's exciting to see that, but again, the excitement and hope don't actually get us there. We need the concrete action. And so I think that's the main point, is that, it is an exciting time to see the investment and the opportunity and the structures forming, but they have to turn into real opportunity and real consequence. And I think that's one of the tricks with adaptation, is that it's a slightly amorphous thing, and it's a slightly complicated process. And to measure its impact and to understand when it's truly effective is something that we need to reckon with. And also what adaptation means, because, adaptation as a Western construct is, relatively new in the grand scheme of things of science. When you look at Indigenous people on the land, adaptation and resilience is core to their worldview and activity for millennia. And so how do we start to incorporate these things? How do we start to understand what it means to be on the land and in a relationship with the land in a way that is cyclical and responsive and respectful? And there's a lot to be learned, I think, yet in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I was attending a seminar recently that was run through the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. Have you heard of that group before?
Yeah.
And a key takeaway was the use of the term land relations planning as opposed to land use planning. And it's some little things like that that stick with you as, key messages, and just kind of tweaks your perception on that type of thing, like these, equitable relations with the land. In that vein, I wanted to ask you, you've done a lot of work on climate change impacts on the health of Indigenous communities in the North. Can you talk about that work, and, whether or not you think that disproportionate impact on those communities has been translated to, I guess, the Canadian consciousness largely? Has that message come across? And if not, what do we need to do to raise that alarm?
Yeah. It's a good question. And one of the things I like to kind of tackle right off the hop is this idea of vulnerability. We've become obsessed with kind of vulnerability assessment, and it's very easy for, academics to look at a climate map and say, the North is vulnerable. These are all vulnerable communities and populations. And in a sense, that's true, but we often undervalue that resilience and capacity and knowledge and long-term persistence of people on this landscape. So in the North, when I think about climate change and I think about being ready, I think to myself, do I want to be in Winnipeg, when things get gnarly, or do I want to be in the Arctic? And, push comes to shove, I think the people of the North, the Inuit that I've interacted with, they're far more prepared than many of these large urban centers, where if you don't know where your food comes from and there's supply chain disruptions like we've seen in the pandemic, and you don't have the requirements to kind of literally look after yourself, you're in a lot of danger. Whereas these communities, they have a deep and rich understanding of how to look after themselves and in relationship with the land in a way where they know how to procure their own food. And yes, it's not like they're disconnected from the Western supply chains and stores and Western goods, but at the same time, there is an understanding of what it takes to look after yourself. And I think if we all ask ourselves at the end of the day, do I know how to look after myself? Do I really know how to look after the kind of core things that I need to have my family safe if things get really, really complicated? And in many cases, in the kind of Western urban reality, the answer is no. We are so codependent on these larger systems that are actually quite vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Supply chains, energy, all of these things that are beyond our control. And so when I think about vulnerability and I think about what that means, I often look at the Western system and I go, you know what? We need to be doing vulnerability analysis on ourselves and quit pointing fingers because we're actually quite vulnerable. But that point aside, the Indigenous communities that I've worked with, literally from coast to coast to coast, we can't frame them all as one. First Nations are so diverse, Inuit are so diverse, Métis communities so diverse, and there's these different kinds of knowledges that are place-based and very specific and experiences. But there's also some amazing commonalities. And one of the recent things that we put together was an academic paper with Elder Dave Kershane and the elders at the Turtle Lodge, which is an Indigenous lodge in Seguin First Nation, about an hour and a half north of Winnipeg. And a couple of years ago, we helped organize the Anjasea gathering, which was a gathering of Indigenous peoples literally across North America to come to Turtle Lodge to discuss climate change. And Anjasea in Anishinaabe-Moan means a changing earth. And it's not kind of value laden in that it's changing good or bad, it's just changing. And under the kind of understanding of this, we had a 4-day discussion in the lodge, Elder Kershane overseeing the dialogue. And as these conversations go, it started with a charge to talk about climate change. And I was like, this is going to be amazing. And day 1 and 2 and 3, it started to deviate into these massive conversations about society and about, relationship to land and colonialism and all of these things. And I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, like, what are we doing? Are we going to get it? The Western trained white guy who doesn't totally understand. And by the end of it, we came back to, and the elders came back to this idea that climate change is a symptom. And the real cause of climate change is the disconnected way in which humanity is operating, and the lost, the sense that we are lost, and that as the elders say, we need a change of the human heart. We really need to recenter ourselves and better understand our relationship with the land and what it actually means. And so these elders kind of said, like, climate change is something that is happening, but it's a symptom. And colonization and the way in which society operates and the way that human beings work together or against each other and together or against the land and environment is really the kind of cause of these larger issues. And so we actually published a paper recently in Climatic Change about that very topic and that very process and that experience. And I think it's just so powerful because it demonstrates that different way of seeing the world, but also the relationship that it can have with, say, something like climate science, and the way in which the academic community can come together to understand these things. And I think that's the kind of fulsome conversation that many of these Indigenous communities bring to the table, and the different perspective and the critically important perspective, where decolonization and science and moving forward in a way that betters humanity as a starting place will ensure that climate change starts to kind of sort itself out. And so, I think there's just a lot of lessons there, and I'm always humbled to kind of interact with Indigenous colleagues in this regard. And that's one example. There are many examples of the leadership that these communities are taking to guide science in a sense. And that guidance is important because, as we know, science is like a flashlight in the dark. You can point it at something and, really see high resolution, what a certain part of the world looks like. But we often lack the context. And again, this Indigenous knowledge is a really important context to help us think about where should we be flashing, pointing the flashlight so we get at some of these important issues that can better all of us.
Yeah. One concept that's, in part come out of conversations like that is the One Health framework for examining, I guess, in human interactions with the environment, where we think about environmental health, animal health, and human health. And yeah, I think I attended another seminar. One of the speakers was Copper Jack from, I think he's in the Yukon. He works a lot with CPAWS in the Yukon. And I think he published a paper with people from CPAWS in Science about that very thing. And it seems to be an application that's kind of taking hold. I'm seeing, new ads for professorships based on that concept. So it feels like there are a lot of things moving in that direction with that more holistic perspective. Not to say that the science is not useful, but people are taking these, multiple angles on these complex environmental issues.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I don't want to denigrate the science, right? I'm committed to the science in a huge way. It's neat when you see it in relationship with all of these other things and all of those considerations together. I think if we can start to build policies in these ways, if we can start to build scientific research programs, as you've suggested, in these ways, we do start to kind of leverage and I think speed up the ability to kind of get that bold action that we need, because we're moving together in a collective way that understands these diverse ways of knowing. And Robin Kimmerer, the braiding sweetgrass, right? Just weaving these things together, like it's the opportunity to do this now has never been greater, and the responsibility to do it has never been greater.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, like the climate change conversation specifically has really, like in the last, 5 years or so, shifted from this, science focused, we just need to tell them the science and they'll understand, to really this social justice issue, this much bigger picture. And like you said, like climate change is, a symptom of so much more that's going on. And so maybe, as we kind of wrap up our interview with you today, I know you're involved with this sort of new organization, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And this is, I guess, really kind of bringing these experts together from all these different disciplines in Canada to think about, how do we address climate change, but, from that big picture perspective, that it's not just about climate change. It's about all of these other aspects. And so maybe, you could speak a little bit about your experience with that organization so far and the kind of conversations you're having within that group.
Yeah, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is another kind of going concern, like the amount of activity and the amount of things that have started to happen. And there was yet another massive gap there, right, where we just simply didn't have a nationally kind of coordinated institute focus on answering some of these kind of key questions that we needed immediate answers to. And, for example, the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy got kind of closed. They had done the last economic modeling on the climate costs for Canada, and that was in 2012.
Yeah.
We're in 2021, and the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices has just in the past year released one of their big economic assessments saying, hey, this is where we're at right now. And so that kind of critical information, looking at economic impacts, but much more than that. And so they have an adaptation panel, they have a mitigation panel, they have a clean growth panel, and all these different experts that are folded into these different knowledge areas. And they leverage us and they ask us for guidance. And then they have a whole core team of staff that are working through and developing reports. And so it's a collaborative model of kind of generating information, but they have some very serious horsepower in that organization to deliver. And if you take a look at their reports on their website, they're fantastic, good graphic layout, easy to read, friendly to policymakers, but very, very rigorous scientifically. And so I was doing a literature review recently for a particular project, and I took a deep dive back into these things that I've been kind of involved in. I was like, wow, this is such good scholarship and this is such good information, and it's publicly accessible. And so they're there to position and kind of coordinate a lot of that academic research into ways that do feed into policy. And so they're specifically designed to give guidance to the federal government around, the pressing issues and the emerging research in these various kind of areas of priority. And so I think it's a really good kind of megaphone. It's amplifying the kind of message of researchers across the landscape. It's packaging it. It's making it, again, in communication sense, palatable and understandable to policymakers. If you look at some of the recent policy documents, the Canada Science 250 document, and some others, they quote the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices very early on in some of these kind of core reports, saying like, hey, this is what we understand about what's going on in Canada. And that kind of ability to have like a focused reference point for it is really, really important, because it's all about coordination, right, and communication. And so that's part of the important role that organization is playing. And I'm involved, but there's a lot of people involved in that. And I think that speaks to the strength. We've spoken about transdisciplinarity, the importance of holistic thinking. I would say that's an organization that's really doing that quite well.
And so, how do you think Canada policy-wise is doing? We have now this group who's making policy recommendations, but in terms of actually what we're doing and how we're meeting targets, et cetera, like what's your take on kind of how we're doing in this country so far with climate change?
Well, I think there's probably better people to ask than me, but pathologically, we love to blow past our targets. Right. And I think that is something that we absolutely need to come to grips with as a country, and many countries around the world need to come to grips with. And, there's these graphs on the internet that I've pulled, where it shows, all our successive targets where we want to wind down our emissions. And I'm sure you've seen these, and how the line just keeps going past them. And literally, the science of blowing past targets, like you can see all the commitments and all the ways in which we've blown past those commitments over time. And that simply has to stop. And that is a matter of political will. It's a matter of tough choices. It's a matter of compassion. That ultimately, as we were talking about the alienation of the West, the Prairie Climate Centre, we are committed to these communities that are part of the geographies and places we call home. We can't just upend Alberta and turn it over overnight. We can't displace oil and gas and coal workers and tell them to kind of go find a new job. There has to be transition plans. There has to be an understanding of the social and political cost of moving communities into a different space and incentivizing that and creating an opportunity for people to do it in a good way. If we get into a situation where policy choices further have people undermining the credibility of science and saying, no, none of this makes sense, we get into these populist discourses, and we've seen where that goes. And these things are interconnected. We have to have a broader understanding of climate science and climate policy in the context of what's going on in the world. And if we don't land these things in the right kinds of ways, we're going to lose precious time. And in some ways, you have to go slow to go fast. And I think in some communities, we need to go at the pace of change. We need to understand kind of how information flows and what it means to kind of introduce ideas and programs, and what that will take to kind of transition certain sectors to, renewables and whatnot. And that needs to be calculated, that needs to be understood. And so I think, that awareness is percolating. We can't, go out and, do this with a sledgehammer. We need to be sensitive in a certain kind of way in those areas. But at the same time, where we have the ability to get traction and move quickly, we need investment, and we need projects, and we need research, and we need action. Again, coming back to the pandemic, I think that we are in a place where government intervention has never been so pronounced in our lives. We are doing this conversation the way that we are doing it because governments have told us this is actually how we need to interact now. Governments have told us that, no, you're not going to fly in those kinds of ways, and you're not going to be able to just go and act the way that you want because the market-based economy tells you that you can. And the fact that we are having conversations about limits, hard limits on behavior, hard limits on what the science tells us, that needs to be brought into a larger conversation about the future of life on this planet. Because we need to have science-based policy now for climate change in a way that we have it for the pandemic. And, we have a chief public health officer for Canada. We need a chief climate change officer for Canada. We need, every time there's climate policy, a scientist standing beside the prime minister with the same kind of influence. And, you see this kind of ability for us to get traction on public health because the scientists are at the table and they're on camera and they're talking about what needs to happen. And again, I think we have an opportunity here to change the way in which we treat science and we interact with community to really get on the right track with this. And so I think it's very exciting. And at the same time, it's a critical moment. If we blow past the pandemic and we're like, okay, we're back to normal, and we don't actually figure out how to land on our feet and learn the lesson of the pandemic and transition it to these other areas, then we will literally miss the only moment that humanity has to kind of get this right. Because the amount of investment, when you think about the billions that they're spending on the recovery, if we don't align that with climate and we don't align that with getting us to this, build back better, as you mentioned, we will not have the resources to do this again. And so we're at that critical moment. And again, I think what I'm hearing is there isn't a desire to align these things, but there's kind of in a sense, a lack of research and capacity. And that's where these organizations like the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, the conversations that we're having, all these research centers linked to community to find a way to hone that together, that we're in the moment where this could make the difference.
And it seems like, there's some growing global kind of momentum, in particular, in the United States. They're doing, or at least planning to do a lot, it looks like. And so hopefully that momentum will just, keep going.
I think that's a critical point, right? In an election, Canada got leapfrogged by the US on climate policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like in a flash, right? And so now we're playing catch up. And that is also a really interesting experience, I think, for the government, where they were seen as these kind of global climate leaders, and now we're perhaps even considered a laggard. And so I think that competition to see who can be better on climate change, let's have that race.
Yeah,
that's the race we should be having, and let's make that the metric of what a good society is.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, maybe just like a final question, I think we talked a little bit about education and various dimensions of that when we were talking about the Climate Atlas. And so there's been this huge surge in youth engagement with the climate change issue lately, which is just so amazing. It's just, I love to see that. It's incredible, but it's upsetting because these young people are anxious about climate change, and it gives me hope, but it also, makes me, sad for that generation in a way that they feel this anxiety. And so maybe, I don't know, do you have any advice about how, if young people who are maybe anxious about climate change can kind of channel that into kind of maybe a career or an education or something to sort of feel like they're looking at solutions as they go forward?
Well, I think you answered the question, right? And I think that it is a daunting time. It's a daunting time for everyone, but especially young people. I've got children, I know you folks do. It's hard to give guidance. It's hard to know what to say when that awareness that, the thing that keeps you alive, we're like systematically destroying. That realization, you become educated and you realize how preposterous the system is. And that idea that parents and adults and scientists and governments have perpetuated it ad nauseum for decades and decades, and just how defeated you can be when you just start your journey into trying to understand. And that is such a sad starting place. But, I think we all started there at some level. I remember getting into environmental science, and I have strong mental health, I would say. Year 2 of my environmental science degree, I was pretty depressed, and I was thinking like everything I do is contradictory. I live in a big sprawling prairie city and I need a car, and that means that I'm killing the environment, and it's hard to reconcile all the contradictions. But I think the literature is pretty clear. There's a certain amount of helpful anxiety, and that anxiety that drives the ability to engage, and it forces people to kind of get involved. And it's like an S curve, right? When you get past that and it starts to become a defeating level of anxiety, then it shuts down your ability to act. And so we have to be very careful how we modulate this and how we experience this. And, you see a lot of these climate activists getting burnt out and having to step away. And so, it's about community care. It's about being part of relationships, as we've talked about, knowing your limits, and also realizing that it's a relay race. You got to pass the baton, and you got to refresh, and you got to come back to the race to kind of run your segment. And I think as we start to kind of understand that as individuals, and we build that larger kind of cohesive response as a community, we lighten the load. And it's not just me figuring this out. We're part of a community, and that feels good. That is healthy. And I think that the youth movement right now is very powerful. I have tremendous respect for young people. I think that they are going to define the future, but this isn't in a way where we just kind of pass the baton to them and say, hey, it's your future. You got to go figure it out, right? It requires everybody to support the next generation in their demands. And, that leads to voting. It leads to all kinds of things that will create an opportunity for political agency that I don't think we've seen. And that moment is upon us, because I think we are all of a generation now where we realize the importance of this, and there's no turning back. As more young people become involved, the system is going to shift. And to me, that's all part of this like dynamic system that we're in, right? This super organism, and the young people creating the sunlight that is, building the photosynthesis for the thing to just explode into growth. Like it is the raw energy of the system right now, is those young people driving for change. And again, I think that will grow and evolve into something quite fabulous, with the dose of reality, right? We have to realize that that kind of ecosystem can get scorched, it can get dried out, and that it can be vulnerable too. Mm-hmm. And that life is something that needs to be attenuated to and carefully thought and managed. And also, I would say the agency of the earth, if Indigenous people have taught me anything, Lovelock talks about the Gaia theory, but he was only kind of getting into the kind of cosmic constellations of gases on other planets and realizing this thing is a superorganism. And that's what Indigenous people have been telling us forever. And that idea that the earth has its own mandate, and that it is going to also guide us, and it is going to help us if we respect it. And that opportunity, and I think that understanding amongst youth, Indigenous or not, is there. And so again, I have a lot of faith in the earth itself. And I think that as we put our faith in the earth and we understand what it teaches us, we can get there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ian. It's been amazing talking to you, and you've had such a wealth of different experiences. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ian.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's great to connect with you folks.